I'm of the belief that you can actually choose to have a lens which sees awe as well as the ordinary. When you do, you can see things that are around us all the time as absolutely magnificent sources of extraordinary, astonishing marvellousness.
For episode 32, my guest is Tiu de Haan, who is a ritual designer, creative facilitator, and serendipity, devoted to the creation of experiences that connect us to ourselves, to each other, and to the possibility of wonder. Tiu is a friend after we met at an intimate, transformative festival several years ago, and as well as being a first-class hugger, I can speak from experience that her workshops are brilliant and she really does bring wonder wherever she goes. In this conversation, we discuss how to bring magic into the mundane, the importance of ritual and grief, and how to open up to more creativity in your life. I would like to say thank you to our latest patrons, Marianne Jago and Joanne Burrells. If you love this show and find anything we share useful, please do make a monthly donation to help us cover our team costs. You can do this over on www.thefutureisbeautiful.co/community. And I want to say a thank you to our team, Lucy White and Mary Chan. We are very much enjoying having an all-female, diverse team working remotely from different parts of the world. Lucy writes the titles, blog posts, and show notes that go along with each episode. She's been part of the team from the very beginning. She specializes in writing website copy and blog content for independent businesses, entrepreneurs, and creatives through her company, Glowing Phrases. She draws on her own experience as a creative and serial entrepreneur to quickly get under the skin of what you do and why you do it, producing clear, concise copy with your core messages shining through it. If you'd like to find out more and chat to her about working together, she comes highly recommended. Please visit www.glowingphrases.com. And if you're a woman and would like to join me in Spain under the October full moon, please join Wild Grace, A Heroine's Journey, which is a week-long retreat I'm facilitating that's all about getting us out of our boxes, finding more aspects of our power, including our creativity, courage, and soul radiance, using practices including yoga, meditation, mythology, mantra, and ritual, plus plenty of surprises. You can find out more over on www.amisha.co.uk. I hope that you enjoy this episode and we keep making the future a little bit more beautiful together, each and every day. Welcome to The Future is Beautiful, with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between politics, spirituality, creativity, and sustainability. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a brighter future, despite the challenges we face as a global community or the pressures that we meet in our daily lives. When we stop and dare to dream, to ask ourselves the big questions and to share what we are already doing, we create the future that we wish to wake up for. That future is beautiful. Tiu, it's so wonderful to be here with you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. It's so lovely to be here.
I want to dive straight in and get a nice understanding of what wonder is and why we need it.
Okay, so wonder, I define it differently every time I describe it, but for me right now, in this moment, wonder is the ability to see the sparkle around things that appear to be dense and solid and normal. It's bringing the imagination into relationship with the reality in which we exist. It's seeing the magic in the mundane. It's awakening that sense of awe, of delight, of curiosity, of the possibility that something above and beyond our daily reality is happening alongside it, and connecting with the things that unite us as human beings, like the fact that we've all been 7, unless you're under 7, in which case you haven't yet been 7, but the chances are, I'm guessing, that the people listening to this are above 7, and they've all had that sense of excitement and aliveness, and we've all fallen in love, and most of us have experienced death in some form, which is this vast opening to an unknown. Most of us have some sense of creative aliveness in some form in our lives, whether it's through appreciating other people's inspiring works of art or creating our own. And wonder is also relating to something that can be described as spiritual. For those to use that language, it's something other. It's connecting to something other. It's basically moving out of the gross, simple, mundane reality into the idea that that can be infused with more and with things that we don't yet understand and that we don't yet know.
Beautiful. And so in our like everyday lives, how does having an openness to wonder kind of change our experience?
I believe that we can choose our perspectives. Now, you can start with that premise as in itself flawed, in that you can sort of say, well, we're programmed in lots of different ways, or we have a bunch of different influences that force our perspective in a particular direction, or give us biases that we aren't even aware that we hold when we regard situations or people or ourselves or possibilities. But I'm of the belief that you can actually choose to have a lens which sees awe as well as the ordinary. And when you do, you can see things that are around us all the time as absolutely magnificent sources of extraordinary, astonishing marvellousness. Like a friend of mine who is an emphatic atheist and has no truck with anything remotely kind of hippie or woo-woo, can just look at the stars and be absolutely blown away by trying to understand the distances that are visible at night. You know, just really simple things which are around us all the time suddenly become these fascinating sources of wonder. Or the workings of the human body. You know, if you just suddenly tune into the amount of different things that are going on in any given second, connecting up these parts of my brain and body with the words that are coming out of my mouth, it seems so ordinary, and yet it's absolutely mind-blowing when you start to kind of break it apart. And then those are just things that are around us all the time. Those are two tiny examples.
And so, for example, a helicopter just flew close to us, and one perspective could be like, oh, that's really annoying, we're recording a podcast. And then the other is, wow,
there's a whirly bird in the sky,
and there are humans in it,
and there are humans in it, and somebody invented that, and how the hell does it stay up, and where's it going, and what's the story behind the, you know, like everything can be seen with this perspective of fascination. I think in order to awaken that in ourselves, we need to be available to the idea that the mundane can be infused with this other. Now, for some people, that can reside in scientific exploration, which is totally one path into. I work with quantum physicists, or have done quite a lot of work with quantum physicists, and the nature of their reality is just extraordinary. I mean, the fact is they're in labs and they think in terms of numbers and equations, and they work with, I was doing this big piece of work with these guys whose expertise is in photons, which is essentially teeny tiny particles of light. And my job was to get them to think outside the box, to get them to play more, to imagine better. Because these geniuses, despite the nature of their work being quantum, whatever that actually means, and I'm not qualified to entirely try to define that, but their reality was linear, because their reality was being in labs and doing experiments. So I would take them to the forest and get them to connect with their ability to imagine other worlds, and then teach them how to find portals into other realities and go through them at will. And so I took this whole cohort of quantum physicists on these adventures for a year, taking these people who are intellectually engaged with what to any layperson is already a source of wonder, because quantum physics is voodoo as far as I can. I mean, it's not. It's clearly not. It's clearly literally the opposite. But to a layperson, to me anyway, it doesn't make logical sense. And yet my job was to take them out of their situation and put them into an expansive, imaginative openness. Does that kind of answers your question in a sort of sideways way? I've gone off on a bit of a tangent.
Oh, we're all about the tangents.
Okay, fine.
Yeah, it totally does. Yeah, that beauty of being open to enjoy whatever is around you, and it's kind of the opposite of that sort of busy, stuck
Yeah,
mindset that's
right.
quite easy to get into, especially if you live in a city, especially if you have a high pressured job,
Yeah.
especially if you have a big sense of like mission, purpose. It can get quite serious.
And if you're tired, I think actually a sense of purpose and mission isn't necessarily going to take you off piste. That can be an ally in the process of experiencing wonder. But what really gets in the way is exhaustion and lack of self-care. Also, I don't have kids, but I have worked with children for many years, and I've worked with families for many years. And I don't do that right this minute, but my experience was often if you're a parent, you inhabit this place of holding the stress, the concerns, the organization, the feeding people. You forget your own ability to see wonder and play. That becomes the area entirely confined to children. And there's something about a separation of the skill set where you go, okay, if you're a kid, you get to play and think and wonder and create, and I get to do the accounts and cook the dinner and clean the house and not sleep enough and worry about you. And that separation negates adults' version of their own playful, creative space. And I feel like sometimes you can have it made more available through having children in your life, but often that which we inhabit as adults often is distanced from a state of wonder. And I think we're impoverished as a result of that process. But the good news is we have all experienced it. It's a completely universal thing. We can all access it, and it cuts through all methods of cultural significance being created. It cuts through all religions, it cuts through all age groups, it cuts through all political beliefs. Everybody is united by these universal experiences of birth, which is a cause of wonder, love, death, childhood, nature, play, grief, art, food, sex, like all the things that are completely universal to every single human being on the planet, whether or not you live in a mansion or a hovel. All of those things are common to all of us, and those are the pivot points which we can shift and use as our access points to wonder. That's my choice of view anyway, I think. I don't know if that's universally held, but that's how I choose to see it.
Beautiful. And so what do we do to make that step to choose wonder?
So the first thing is to figure out what's in the way of you experiencing wonder. So for example, if you've only had 3 hours sleep, don't try to then also make yourself the most creative, alive, wonder seeking part of yourself, unless you do it through sleep deprivation, in which case go for it. But that's
That
not my
can open up a whole other world.
I mean, that's true for some people. But first of all, take care of the nourishment that you need in order to feel available to it. Turn off screens for at least a little while. Connect with your food, connect with the parts of yourself that are simple, like simple, nourishing self-care creates the foundation that allows you to be rested and present enough that you can then hoik your gaze up and look for the magic. So starting with something really simple and acknowledging that most of us don't even do that part. So most of us are so stressed and distracted and running to stay centered, and that we grapple with physical health problems and mental health problems and overwhelming planetary problems and there's so much in the way of our basic wellness that to then put on top of that a desire to then and now be Disney is not helpful, because then you just feel like you're failing to create a life of magic on top of all it. So the first thing is take care of the basics. And when you're in a space of commitment to that self-care, you don't necessarily have to have mastered it, because most of us don't. But once you're at least engaged in the question of going, what do I need right now? How can I connect with my intuition? Where do I need to rest and release and nourish and connect? Then going on adventures, basically. So adventures of the kind where you choose to see the wonder in what you're experiencing in the world with a timer if you need to. So one of the things that I do, and I do it alone, is I set a timer on my phone for 20-25 minutes, and I go out and I wander and I look for it. I mean, I literally look for it. I literally will go. So I had this hilarious one the other day. I decided I needed more magic in my life. I was running a bit low on a sense of wonder, which is something that obviously I need to have in place in order to do what I do and be who I am. So I kind of set an intention that I was going to go on a mission looking for wonder for 20 minutes. And as soon as I left my front door, I was looking for it. So that means looking out for, I don't know, a balloon that somebody's let go of that's floating through the sky, or a song coming out through a car window as it passes you, which has a particular lyric which leads you somewhere, or a flower that is particularly delicious to smell, or a series of any number of tiny little things, or somebody who you connect with on the street and smile with, like just looking for those little tiny triggers. And then it gets big quite quickly for me, I find. So once you set an intention and you set a timer and you make that your deliberate focus, I got to the tube station near where I live, and there was nobody else in there in the entrance hall where the ticket machines are. And one of the ticket machines was flashing on and off like it was broken. And I went over to it, and as I went over it spat out 5 gold coins. I felt like I was in a computer game. Like, thank you very much. And that's what I'm talking about. Like, once you deliberately look for it and you're looking for signs of other people having created beauty in the world, for there being connection, flow, joy, you find quite epic examples of it. I had one other one which I particularly enjoyed. I set a timer. I was in Liverpool Street Station, very hectic station in London. It was rush hour, and I stood at the street level entrance to it, and I just decided I was going to experience this. I was like, I'm just going to set a timer and see what I see. So that means not looking at your phone, by the way. You have to use the world around you to get this information. And I stood there, and it was about 30 seconds of standing there going, maybe I'm asking too much. Maybe this won't happen. Maybe I'm just, these are stressed out people in rush hour. They're looking at their phones. They're not going to be engaging. So I'm standing there thinking, am I going to be disappointed by the lack of wonder that I'm going to be experiencing right now? And just as I was having that thought, right in front of me, this couple were having a conversation, and this girl was wearing a small rucksack, and she opened it up, and inside there was an African violet in a pot. And she took out the African violet in a pot, and she put it on a bollard, and she zipped up her rucksack, and she walked away, leaving this flower there. I was like, who does that? Like completely, just almost invisibly, just in this moment of tiny little rogue acts of beauty, she just decorated the front of Liverpool Street Station. That's what I'm talking about. When you start looking for it, it's everywhere. When you add into that infiltrating the world with your own little rogue additions to that stuff, like carry around a stick of chalk and just leave little love notes on the pavement, or secrete love letters in cereal packets in supermarkets. Just go and write a love letter to a stranger and leave one in there, or tie a balloon to something that looks a bit sad. Or you can go and manipulate your environment as well, but you don't need to. It's simply just a case of seeking it. Googly eyes are brilliant, by the way. I bulk buy googly eyes, stick-on googly eyes. You carry them around with you, and you stick them on things and make faces out of things. And if people are wandering past them and they notice them, they have this little tiny moment of wonder, and the whole thing grows. But it's this acceptance of the fact that when you see through the lens where you seek that stuff out, you find evidence to support its existence pretty much everywhere you look. And that's just in mundane urban reality. I'm not even starting on the realms of, people who are creating extraordinary art in the world, or people who are setting up incredible movements to transform the experience of the multitudes to be better than it is right now. Like that, I'm talking tiny, tiny little micro moments of wonder. There are vast swathes of extraordinary things that you can choose to focus on if you look for them.
So it's like it's all there and it's waiting for us to play with it. And the more that you say, yes, I'm here, I'm playing, I'm in the game, it's like the more that it shows up and interacts with you.
That's right. There's a there's an instruction which was on a badge that somebody gave me, which says engineer serendipity. Serendipity doesn't obey regular laws, but you can create the conditions in which it is more likely to appear. And those conditions include self-care, but they also include a willingness to treat your environment as a source of delight. They include the ability to be present and to connect to other people. They include a memory of what it's like to be 7 or 8 or 9, because we have that in there. Even if you didn't have a good childhood, you still have had an experience of play. You have. You just wouldn't be here if you hadn't. So creating the conditions in which you invite wonder is the art form, and then it happens by itself. And seeking it out. And also, just to balance it, it can be seen as sort of Pollyanna-ish, as a sort of like blindness to the dark, as a sort of a willful ignoring of the crisis in which we live. But one of the reasons I love your podcast is the title, The Future is Beautiful. This is kind of an example of what I'm talking about. I was recently asked by somebody to create, if I wanted to collaborate on creating a ritual for the end of the world. And I've declined thus far, because it made me really clarify what it is that I want to focus on. And what I want to focus on is cracking open the imagination, is connecting us all to this universal sense of possibility and of wonder, and to connecting ourselves to the heart of our own experience, but also that of others. And while part of me goes into the idea that focusing on the brevity of life and the sanctity of nature and the fragility of this planet can sharpen our awareness of how precious this stuff is, this experience, it can also swerve us into a darker focus, which you have to be deft enough to balance those perspectives. You have to be able to go into the cataclysm and go, how can we access our imaginative ability to find the solution? How can we connect with what it is to be deeply human? And that, to me, requires a sort of a willingness to ask the question, what if this were eliciting my power, my beauty, my depth, my compassion, my love? What if the crisis were sharpening all of us into becoming what we're here to be? And then you're facing into the darkness and accessing your light at the same time. But a singular focus on the end isn't where I want to put my energy. I want to put my energy into the imaginative expansion of what we can create, of what we might resolve.
I love that. And on this show, we really do talk about the darkness quite a lot. And we talk about, the grief, the struggle of acknowledging where we are, seeing things that break our hearts, whatever it is. But it's all about, finding more resource in us to create something that's beautiful. And part of that resource is finding ways to make a day delightful.
Yeah.
Like literally.
Also, what it does is it exercises the muscle which allows your creative thinking to be much stronger and more agile. And your imagination is where the solutions lie. That's my opinion. I think it's the truth. I think there was a brilliant quote from, there's a book called Playing Big by Tara Moore, which I just love, which is a fantastic book about the feminine in particular, people rising into, women in particular, or people who identify as women, rising into their ability to play bigger and to bring the skills which have been so sorely needed by our planet into play, like intuition, collaboration, creative thinking, encouragement, empathy, emotional intelligence, which have traditionally been the kind of domain of women. And because that is the case, and they haven't necessarily been coupled with the strident, risk-taking, kind of classically male action-driven energy, they haven't necessarily been as loud or as audible as they could be. So this book is about allowing those kinds of skills to come up and out in the times when they're needed, right? And in that book, she talks about going to a mentor of hers who tells her that every problem in the world is simply a failure of the imagination. And I love that idea. I was like, oh yeah, so I can't solve all the problems, but I can access the imagination and I can help other people to do the same. So therein, hopefully, lies the toolbox that then people can access to create their own solutions. I didn't go into the work with the quantum physicists pretending that I knew what they were going to do with this expanded imagination, because I don't speak their language. I don't understand what they're doing in the labs. But my way of thinking was, I can create the blank space, which you can then fill. You just may not have had the moment to realize that the space, the potential, the vista is even there. The perspective is even available to you. So I can give you the lens, and then where you go with that lens on, that's your department, because everybody's going to have their own application of that. But we forget to nourish our creativity, our imagination, our joy, our wonder, our perspective of seeing the magic in the mundane. And that's where my juice is. That's where I reside.
And then it's like, if we are all open to our imagination and our creativity, then we are just going to be creating solutions, creating things. I mean, when you look around this room, everything that is in here was imagined by another human being. The idea to have plants, for example, in a pot, like a human did that. Or the idea, there's 100 books in this room, they all came out of somebody by connecting to our imagination. The technology that we're recording this with, it just goes on and on and on.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? And one of the things that I teach is the idea of dancing with those ideas as if they had sentience. I mean, it's not only my idea. This is actually common to an awful lot of different artists and writers and people across the centuries, actually, who interact with the thing that wants to be created. So that, but as well as just entertaining that as an abstract idea, I actively encourage proactive collaboration with it as if it wanted to come into the world. So there's a guitar over there, which is, and imagine the iterations that had to go through in order to become a guitar, as opposed to a lute, for example, or a violin or whatever. But the essence of guitar, which has now landed and settled into its shape, into its rightful, the relationship of the notes on the strings, the length of the neck, the size of and why is the curve where it is in the body of the thing, why is the hole where it, all of those things have settled, That thing, before it became that thing, was hovering around in a slightly more amorphous state, and it was in the imaginal realm, and then somehow, somewhere, somebody made the first one and it evolved through various iterations into the place that it is now, where it's refined, of course, and there are many different people who are going to be creating different versions of it, but essentially it's recognizably itself. And my thing is that essence of guitar, the platonic ideal, if you like, of the guitar, those things are flying around us. This is my belief, or at least I like this idea, that they're hovering around us. Proto form of the microphone, there's something else that's in the ether right now. We don't know what it is yet because we haven't got the physical, tangible form of it, but it's here. And one of the things that I love to do is I work with creative people who are wrestling with a creation or want to birth something, and I ask them to surrender to it, to collaborate with it, to allow it to come into their consciousness and for it to lead. And then it's a case of accessing your imagination and your intuition such that you can speak to it and hear it. Because again, we're not attuned to that. There is some very solid teachings on this that suggest that poems are fully formed before they come through. Symphonies are fully formed. All these things exist in their entirety. And one way of looking at it is that they're floating around seeking a host who has the correct configuration of skills and talents. I'm not going to suddenly, I would imagine, be gifted with the vision for building a factory. That's not in my skill set. So if a factory were to knock on the side of my brain, I'd go, I'm sorry, I'm not the correct collaborator for you. You want to go that way. Whereas,
I don't know, I feel like
well, maybe
you can make a factory.
Okay. I mean, if it made rainbows and like
the Wonder Factory.
Okay, I take it all back. Completely wrong. Yes, of course. What was I even thinking? Unicorn, whatever. Yeah, but yes, you're absolutely right. Of course, it can turn into any configuration, but sometimes things come in the perfect match for what it is that you're here to do.
Yeah. And you can choose. And I mean, that's since now we've now been speaking to my guitar.
Yes.
And we are, of course, in the wonder pool that always happens when you and I are together.
Yes.
But now the guitar is actually saying to me, Amisha, you have been ignoring me.
Yes.
Misha, we have a song to make.
Right.
And I'm like, so brilliant. I'm just, that's there. And
right.
I will.
But the song is probably its own entity as well.
Yeah.
You know, the song is tapping you on the shoulder too. Yeah. And it needs you to pick up the guitar in order for you to unlock the doorway for it to come into the world.
Absolutely. And whenever I've written poems, it is, and it happens all the time where I don't catch them because I don't have a pen and paper, or I think I'll remember it later, and you don't. And it's like, it's this feeling where you just this all this stuff is just downloaded through you. Yeah. And if you just do it in that moment, then it comes and you're like, whoa, how did that come out of me? And you're like, it just came through me. And yeah, I miss them all the time. Like I can feel that they're there, and I know that they're only there in that moment, and then I kid myself that it will be there later.
And I know you have to honor them with being ready to capture them, but they're buggers, man. They turn up at the most inconvenient moments. Like, there's a great story of Tom Waits. In fact, there's a story Liz Gilbert tells in Big Magic, which is a great book about this. And she talks about Tom Waits being in the middle of a car journey, like a long car journey with no recording equipment, I don't know, no notebook or something. And he's driving and he cannot stop. He's in a hurry and a song comes. And he can't capture it. And he's just apparently like hands on the wheel, pissed off, you know. And he basically looks up at the corner and goes, could you just come back later? Like, this is really inconvenient of you. I'm trying my best. I'm here to help. I'm here to channel you into the world. But if you don't turn up when I can actually do the service that you need me to do to you, I won't be able to honour you. So could you just do me a favour and come back? It's irritated with the muse. Liz Gilbert also, in that same book, she talks about this brilliant example of a poet, and I can't remember the name of the poet. It's a woman and it's an American. That's all I can remember. And she lived in rural America somewhere, and she would be working out in the fields. And apparently when she heard a poem coming, it was like a rumbling in the sky. And she knew from experience that she had to run back across the fields in order to get back to her home in time to pick up a pen. And if she did, and she got there in time, the poem would come through the pen and out. Sometimes she missed it, and it would go barreling through her and keep on rolling through the horizon. And she imagined that it was just going to keep on going until it found another poet who could capture it. But sometimes, and this is my favourite, she'd get there just in time to catch it by its tail. And then she'd basically sit down and pull it backwards. And then the whole poem would write itself out, but in reverse.
Wow.
Courting serendipity, engineering serendipity, working in collaboration in harmony with the creative forces is this dance of curiosity, of actively engaging in the idea, at least, of being available to those whispers, of allowing those whispers to be audible to you, which brings us back to the self-care, the lack of digital screens, for a moment at least, you know, the sufficient nourishment, the physical basics, so that you're rested enough, so that when that whisper comes, you're not just playing a game on your phone and stuck in a rush hour tube train and just desperate to get drunk because your life is not allowing you to feel, because there's too much pain to be felt before you can hear the other stuff. So to have some practices in place that allow for that part of your life to be handled enough that you can have moments of connection with these ideas that are gifts coming through you.
And so it's a lot about creating space. So,
yes.
you know, there's the kind of the the famous sort of artist way of like, you know, what are you doing? Just sitting around doing nothing all day. And, you know, you and I know, having both tried to write things, and then of course you were a singer, that there's a lot of time where it really looks like you're doing nothing, and you kind of are doing nothing, but you're kind of just, you're in that space, open and often seeking in a kind of desperate way. But when you can just be open in quite a clear way, it's much easier to catch these things. But also just the need for space in our day. So if every minute is scheduled from when we get up until, you know, when we get somewhere, and the travel time is perfectly mapped out with no minute to look around, then you miss so much. And for me, that's been a really strong practice of having blank space in my day, of leaving a bit of extra time when I travel somewhere. I'm not always so good at that one. I'm often late. But giving yourself the ability to be open.
Yeah, absolutely. And one way of deliberately delineating moments that have a different quality is through making ritual, which is what one of the other things I do. So I help people to design. The way that I see it is it's moment making. It's deliberately putting that container around a moment and turning it into something that is distinct from the rest of the rush of your day. Even though the word ritual is quite charged with religious associations or habit, there's a very common misconception that ritual is your morning coffee or your shower, and it's not. That's a habit. That's a repeated behavior. The thing that distinguishes ritual from habit is meaning making. And when we deliberately make a moment into something meaningful, we are adding in this whole layer of imaginative weaving. We're making an experience meaningful by setting aside time, adding in elements of some sort of external evidence that it's different, like we might light a candle, or we might eat a particular kind of food, or we might open a particular notebook, or we might talk to our guitar that wants us to write a song, or we might write a song. We're busy. Just come back to no. And those are just the kind of the really simple one, or like how we wash ourselves, or how we prepare food, or how we begin work, or how we finish work, how we sleep, how we wake, how we clean our home, how we travel, how we commute, how we connect with our colleagues, how we engage with a creative project. And that's just the daily stuff. Then we've got the bigger things like birth and death and love and leaving a career behind, or getting over an illness, or moving on past a breakup, or working through a trauma, or any number of much bigger things that also deserve, I think, obviously I would say this because this is my shtick, but that deserve a deliberate creation of an experience to honor some aspect of this experience of life. And creating space deliberately as a creative act in itself is where I find it really interesting. So everything we've talked about so far, even though we've touched on writing poems or writing music or whatever, like the blank canvas that I find most interesting is life itself. So it can then morph into writing a book or singing a song or making a podcast or whatever. But for me, the bits that I find most juicy, and which require no audience, frankly, because you can do it entirely on your own, for your own benefit, for your own edification and delight, is just making a moment that is an artwork and carving out those gaps and making them something that is beautiful and meaningful and offers a transition point in your day is where you can begin to hear the whispers. But they're not empty space, they're full. You know, you've made them meaningful. You've added in colour and sound and food and smell and light and music or silence or some practice. You know, there's something that goes into those things. I've recently been learning about how to incorporate those things in cycles because we're cyclical creatures. Part of the evolution I think that we're experiencing is going from this headlong linear drive towards growth and into something more cyclical that allows for fallow periods as well as fertile periods, as well as different kinds of eras of our own life, of our own day, of each project, of all sorts of different things. So I've been learning about the fact that, for example, it's pretty obvious, but as menstruating women, we have different, very strongly delineated parts of the month where we are in very different states. Sometimes we're quiet and we want to reflect and dream, and sometimes we're out in the world and we're active and we're connecting. And that's within a month cycle. And then there's within each day, and then there's within each workflow. A project, for example, can go from inspiration to completion over the course of several months or several years or several days, and within that, it's allowing yourself to attune to what it wants to become, where it pulls you forward and where it goes, no, have a nap. I'm a great one for naps. I love allowing myself the space to have that kind of moment of resting. And then when I naturally feel to move towards something, I follow that flow. And luckily, I don't have an external structure that I'm bound to. I'm a freelancer and I work odd hours and I work all the time or not at all. I've been self-employed since I was in my early 20s. I haven't had a proper job for years. So I haven't had to force somebody else's rhythm onto my own. So I realised that's the luxury or a choice, depending on I've chosen that over the security of having a regular paycheck. But the more that we can allow those spaces, the more that we can hear the whisper of our guitar, and also then the other things that call us forward, and we can attune to something that feels healthier. And then my sense is we become part of a murmuration of other beings who are in that same flow. It's my experience. Like when you're attuned to that thing, the synchronicity goes up exponentially, and suddenly you go, I think I want to write a book. Oh, hang on a minute. There's a publisher who I just happened to be having a chat with at somebody else's party, and then an agent. Like all of these things align really quickly when you're spacious enough to listen and act and rest. It all speeds up. The synchronicity is expedited, basically. Mm-hmm. That's a very roundabout way of saying taking naps is the way forward.
And I guess what you were just saying kind of leads us into pronoia, which would be lovely if you explained.
Sure. Pronoia is a made-up word, not by me. It's actually made up apparently by the guy who wrote the Grateful Dead lyrics. But pronoia is the opposite of paranoia. So paranoia is the belief or experience that the universe is conspiring against you, that everyone hates you and everything's awful and everything's wrong. Pronoia is the exact opposite, where it's the belief or the perspective that everything in the universe is conspiring to shower you with blessings, even when they're in disguise. And what it does is it's a lens through which you can choose to see your reality. I experience pronoia as something which I find very useful, but it's a choice. It's a lens through which we choose to see. It's not the truth, just like paranoia isn't the truth. However, perhaps if you're stuck in paranoia, it's really difficult to remember that it's not the truth. Pronoia, you can put on and off a little bit more, like at will. I tend to wear that lens all the time, but don't tell anybody. But it's one of those. It's one of those choices of perspectives that makes everything really pretty good fun. So basically, the idea that you're part of a bigger picture in which you are all connected to something which is showering you with blessings means that you choose to see the things that happen, even the really horrible things, as the profound lessons that you needed to learn in order to become who you're here to be. So you reinterpret stuff, good and bad, as if it were for you. Now, that's an egocentric worldview, but the beauty of pronoia is it can happen to everybody all the time at once. And if everybody believes that they're in a state of pronoia, suddenly the whole world tends to agree with you and everything starts to align with that. There's a brilliant book called Pronoia by Rob Brezhny, which is just fantastic and really good fun. Not like a self-help book at all. It's kind of like a bonkers Tom Robbins novel, but it's beautifully done and it's got loads of provocations. The idea of pronoia as a lens is simply in any given situation, ask, what if this were for me? And then to activate your own pronoia, sneak around doing covert random acts of kindness and beauty for other people, giving them the experience of pronoia. So they come out of a stressful business meeting and there's a massive love note written on the pavement in chalk, which they hopefully will notice. And then they turn a corner and there's a love letter tucked into a cereal box in the Tesco where they go in to buy their like you start to infiltrate other people's realities and you don't know how that's going to play out because you're not in charge of it. It has to be random. This is the other thing. Crucial bit of instruction with this. If you start to go around creating pronoia for other people, and I heartily recommend that you do, don't impose that on anybody else's experience. Do not leave a letter under somebody's windscreen wiper because they might think they're being stalked. Don't put a Valentine's through a letterbox into somebody's random flat because you don't know if they're having marital strife and if it's going to kick off a huge row with their other half. Don't reverse pickpocket, even though it's quite fun to reverse pickpocket because they could freak out. But if you want to be really bold, reverse pickpocketing, it's quite fun. So don't impose it. Leave it so that it can just be discovered, so that it has to be random. But what happens is once you start going around doing this stuff, you get gleeful. Almost instantly, you become totally delighted with a really horrible area of an urban, broken down kind of alleyway. You just can't wait to fill it with fairy lights or like to stick a nightlight in a crumbled old wall or to light an incense stick in a sort of piss-soaked alley. You just suddenly see everything as this delightful opportunity to be an elf, basically. As a muscle to exercise, I personally find that it not only has these sort of superficial, joyful, gleeful, fun aspects to it, but it's deeply empowering. Without going into the story, my mum died very suddenly when I was 18 and I gave a TED talk, which I talk about that in depth, and I'm not going to go into the story right now, but it was the single most traumatic and horrible thing that's ever happened to me, and it formed much of who I am. Absorbing her inspiration and lust for life has also informed much of who I am, and healing the trauma and the grief has also informed much of who I am. And so many years later, I look back on that thing that happened and I wonder, her death was awful and I would have her back in a heartbeat. But given that she died when she did and that she gave me the resources that she gave me before she died and that I had the journey after that I had, I'm deeply grateful, genuinely grateful for the cracking of my heart that happened as a result of that and the path that then unfolded as a result. Because I wouldn't be able to do any of the things that I do now had she not died when she did. And it's really interesting to look back on something of that magnitude, of that level of total destruction and desolation. I mean, I'm not going to go into it, but it was vast.
You can.
I'd rather just point people to the TED Talk, which tells the story in depth. I talk about the moment that she died. And that was actually, when I gave the talk, that was the second time I'd ever told that story. I'd never told it in therapy. I'd never told it to anybody apart from once in a group. And so I tell the story with all of the stuff around it. And I'm not going to go into that. But even that devastation, I can see as the most hard and difficult and painful lesson possible in order for me to do what I do now. And also in order to be there for people in death. Not that I'm a death doula, I don't do that, but I have worked, I do honour people's deaths, I work with death quite a lot. And I do funerals sometimes, and I trained with undertakers, and I have an extraordinary relationship with death. Again, partly as a vivifier, partly as this idea that if you remember that this is finite, you're going to sharpen your perception to appreciate the moments that you have and turn those moments themselves into miniature artworks of delight and wonder, because they're not forever. We have a limited number of them. And so even with death, pronoia can apply. It's like, what if that were for me? Well, what if, odd source of wisdom, but I remember the lead singer of Megadeth, of all people, saying, without death, life would be meaningless. Mm-hmm. And that really resonating with me. It's like, yeah, that's true, it would. And so even death, even that kind of the darkest and most difficult, painful thing that we all go through at some point ourselves and our loved ones, that can be a gift. It instantly imparts a love affair with life as a possibility, or a source of fear and anxiety and doom and depression. Depends on the lens you choose, it's like, or the not choose, perhaps it's unfair to, I don't mean to say that depression is chosen. I absolutely do not think that. I think it's a proper disease, and I think that it needs to be handled with care. And I don't mean to give the impression that pronoia is a platitude which you can apply to deep wounds and have a kind of superficial plaster that doesn't deal with the depths of the pain, as we pointed to before. But if you take it in its full power and you really allow that idea of choosing a perspective of empowerment and love and grace and connection and appreciation and creativity, you can transmute even the pain and destruction of our planet into an opportunity for deep connection and awakening and inventiveness and joy and possibility.
Absolutely. It all becomes an initiation, and there is a process that you have to go through that involves actually very deeply honouring the sadness and the grief. I've had quite a lot of death in my life, and Samantha Roddick and I talked about this at length in an earlier episode of the podcast. And I believe that those deaths have helped me see more possibility and have helped me to pull myself out of patterns or the ordinary, if you like. But with that came a huge honouring of the pain, and really allowing that pain to be there, to process through me so that I could move through it. And it's difficult work, and we don't talk about it enough. And it really helps to find people that you can talk to death about, that will give you a different perspective from the like, okay, it's time to move on kind of, or like the, now we don't talk about that. But actually find the gifts in a death. Sometimes the person who died really helps you do it, and sometimes they don't, and you kind of need other people to help because it's a process.
Absolutely. And I think culturally we're ill-equipped to offer the support that people need. It is changing around funerals, but still in terms of grief, it's not really available. Like there's bereavement counselling, but you're sitting in a chair having a contained, intellectualized conversation with another human being for an hour tops. And that doesn't do it. You need a much bigger process, and I think you need to be held by a community as well, like a grief that is felt far and wide by others is helpful. I did some work with Sobonfu Some, who died last year, not that long ago anyway. Sobonfu Some was the keeper of the ritual of the Dagara tribe of West Africa, and she allows for the fact that not only do you grieve dead people, but you grieve relationships, you grieve illnesses, you grieve periods of depression, you grieve planetary collapse, you grieve trauma to an ancestor, you grieve historic epigenetic abuse, whatever. There's so many different things that we don't make space for because we don't have any cultural awareness of the fact that these things are being carried by us. And we continue to distract ourselves and to focus on more growth as if that's going to get us out of it. And maybe it will, I don't know, I don't think it will, but that's the common belief, is like charge forward and then these things will shift of their own accord, maybe. But when you have such complexity and such such a lot of grief, it's really helpful to have a way to grieve it. And this grief ritual that her culture have been doing since time, whatever, since the beginning of records of their culture, of their tribal indigenous people, they do it every month as a community, as the whole tribe get together, and there's this very structured way of releasing all of these layers of grief. And there's always grief that you didn't even know you had to feel. So before you get there, you think you're going to go with, I don't know, a death, a relationship, a job, something, something that's sort of, you go, yeah, no, this is painful. I haven't processed it yet. Counseling didn't quite cut it. I've got this experience that I know I need to release. But once you get into the space of allowing that to come out, what happens is the stuff underneath it that you didn't even know was there has space to come out. And it's this extraordinary practice. It's pretty full on. It's like, it's set up in a very particular way to allow for the whole community to hold the whole community through this expression of grief. And it's not really reflected in anything that I have ever come across in our culture. And apart from, there's something called the Bridge. The Bridge, as I understand, is a 6-day retreat about this, and it incorporates a lot of that work in the same sort of way. I haven't done it, so I don't know, but I know a couple of people that have done it. And it's that sort of extended space and time to go in, through, and out the other side in a very intensive way. I'm not saying it's, it doesn't, not many people can go on a 6-day retreat. It's the kind of thing that our culture lacks, and which these people, the Bridge, have created something which really allows for that to be expressed. But we don't grieve very well. We need to, it's the classic thing when Princess Diana died, the whole world suddenly released all this grief that wasn't just to do with Diana. They all got together and were united in this thing. We do have collective emotional releases, like the World Cup recently, I thought was really interesting. What was happening just energetically in this land where there was hope and optimism and something, and then grief. But there is a murmuration. There's a unification around these emotional things that come and go. And I feel like the more connected we are as a species by virtue of the internet and social media, the more that we share, we tap into the same waves of emotional intensity, be that joy or pain or fear. And I think it's becoming increasingly apparent that we haven't got the things in place to allow for those things to be processed. For those of us that have lovely friendships and who have, great people that we go to for support, who have good community around us, who have a family that is unusual perhaps in its ability to be supportive, those things can be processed to some extent. But I think there's a longing for meaning. And if you don't have a religion as well, like I think religion has historically inhabited the role of being the kind of shepherd through those kinds of unanswerable questions. People would go there with pain and grief and joy and celebration and gratitude, and religion created a context in which that was...
And community.
And guidelines for emotional intelligence and moral fibre and all of those things. And now that we're in an increasingly secular society where those old models no longer necessarily fit in quite the same way, this is the pivot point around the ritual work that I do. This is like the idea of going, it's okay for us to make our own meanings and for us to make our own models that take our emotions out of our heads, where they can't really be resolved unless you're very lucky and you have a really good therapist and you can resolve things through just speaking, which is possible. But it's not my way. It doesn't work very well for me because I've got a good brain and it gets in the way of it. It's tricksy, it can get in front of itself and underneath itself, and it doesn't necessarily get past it into something that is just more simple. I think we're in the phase of creating new meanings, and I think we need to. And I feel like the lack of them leads to the mental health crises that we are seeing everywhere. The rise in suicide, more people die from suicide than from war now. That's statistically true.
In the world? Mm-hmm. Wow. That's shocking.
Yeah, exactly. And that to me says there's this aching need for us to feel like we're connecting to ourselves, to our hearts, to each other, to a sense of possibility, to a sense of wonder, to our ability to be meaning-making machines without, maybe not machines, that seems unkind, to be artists of our own experience and to take creative control over a life that feels connected and creative and heart-centered and like we're engaged in some sort of possibility at least of finding a solution or finding some way through. And I feel like we're at this unprecedented pivot point now, right now. Never ever before have we been at this point where the problems are so vast and so complex, and the people facing into those problems have such connectivity and such a complex set of expectations and needs, and all of those things are configuring with the technological aspect and there's so many different things that have never come together before, and I actually am hopeful. Are you hopeful?
I'm pretty hopeful.
Are
I
you?
feel like this is I feel like we're redefining what it means to be human, and with that there's just a big awakening of lots of our capacity that has been stuck or hasn't had the space to come out. I mean, most societies have been quite class-based and structured, and they still are. But then with technology and with all of these different things, with religion actually opening up and a kind of an ability for anyone to access their wonder, their abilities to see the world differently, that we are moving out of that structure actually. That of course that structure is still there, and if you choose that lens and you really see that it's there and maybe it's getting worse, and there is that story and that's true. But I think we're just at a place where we're holding so many different truths at the same time. And another truth that I really see is that we are able to access so much more in so many different ways. And that does give me hope. I do think that a beautiful future is possible. I don't know if we're all going to make it. And that's scary and something to consider. But I think that's why each of us needs to be as open as possible and as connected to who we really are, whatever that means. And the truth is I say that, having done so much work on myself and knowing who I am.
You can speak to your guitar after all.
Speak to my guitar.
Very advanced.
My guitar is really not happy with how ignored my guitar has been.
Stop talking. Sorry.
But with all of that knowledge, the biggest bit of knowledge that I have is how much I don't know who I am and how much more there is to discover. And so that's really exciting. There was that thing you were talking about this sort of processing of grief earlier, and this is something that has been coming up for me a lot my whole life, but more consciously recently, in the past year or two, which is that I just can't help but process grief. And I can't help processing grief that's not mine if everyone ignores it.
Yeah.
So this thing that you were saying about how it's there, I feel like when we ignore it, it's still there, and somebody or some things, and I believe that it's also the trees and other parts of nature and of our world that are helping with this work. But I need time after big experiences, 2 projects that I've been involved in over the past year or so, which both were have big ambitions, and then at the end of them, it's like some people have been like, boom, that's done, onwards, upwards, focus on the positive. And then I've just been actually like, nope, there's a lot here that we've ignored, that there's fear here, there's grief here, there's sadness, there's anger, and I just have to do it. And I haven't found a way to I just haven't found that it's possible for me to move forward and until I've kind of cleared things up a bit.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, there's an interesting kind of conversation there around like boundaries. But then at the same time, it's like, I don't know, maybe this is the invisible work that women have been doing. And now we're talking about it more. Maybe it's not just open to women, it's open to that feminine nature that we all inhabit. And it's just knowing that it's there. And if more of us were doing it, then it would just be cleared a lot faster and we would have much more of the wonder. But I do find that the more that I do that work, the more that my capacity for wonder also opens up. And so, you know, like everything, there's no kind of martyrdom. It's like, you clean up, you take responsibility, and you enjoy what's there to be enjoyed, and kind of being able to hold both of those things.
That's right. It's living the full spectrum of the experience without putting your fingers in your ears and negating one bit and trying only to experience the other bit without wanting to sound too 70s. The Khalil Gibran prophet thing on joy and sorrow is where he says, you know, I'm going to slightly misquote it now, but basically it's about laughing all of your laughter and crying all of your tears, experiencing the full, your joy is your sorrow unmasked. Basically, your capacity to grieve is equal to your capacity to celebrate. And there's a difference between grief and depression, because depression is not about being able to celebrate, nor is it about grief. It's staying stuck in that much less rich bandwidth of just darkness, which doesn't actually have much. You can have external reasons to be happy and none of them make any sense to you because you're locked in a different kind of reality. But grief is distinct from that. And I feel like very few of us know how to do the work that you naturally do. You know, we're not taught how to do that unless you happen to be raised, unless you're naturally that way inclined, first of all, and then you're sensitive and you need to figure out how to protect yourself when you're in those periods of vulnerability or grieving.
And how to be okay with the fact that you're doing that, because you don't understand. For me, it's like I just haven't understood why I've felt that pain. And then that has tipped into depression at points.
Yeah. So learning how to navigate the light and shadow of your own inner landscape, which requires a level of depth and authenticity and witnessing, because doing that entirely on your own, I think, is also a little dangerous. So one of the things the Dagara tribe say is that grief, when you're grieving alone, doesn't actually shift. It's almost like it burns deeper into your system. Simply being witnessed allows it to move through you. So being witnessed not by somebody who's saying there, shush, stop crying, somebody who's just being with you and witnessing your pain. And with a hand on your back if they're going to touch you, but not squashing you and shutting you down and going shush, stop, but just being. And being witnessed in grief is, I think that's partly why people use social media that way sometimes. I think they just go, I'm having a horrible time. I need to be seen that I'm having a horrible time. And then you've got that whole classic, you okay, hun, kind of like whatever. And there's a people criticize that, but that's essentially the same impulse. It's going, I'm feeling something that is overwhelming me. I need witness. I need somebody to be with me in this, even if it's just somebody somewhere paying lip service to the fact that I'm sharing a tiny little aspect. I think it's a human need to be witnessed and held in community. And if it's virtual, then it's virtual. If it's real, then it's real. But to navigate that stuff that you naturally experience is a skill set that we all need to learn. Mm-hmm. And I have had to learn it because I basically, when my mum died, I was 18. It was 3 months before I went to Oxford, which is the least emotionally open environment you could possibly imagine, entirely severed from the neck down. And nobody there helped me to grieve. There was nothing there. So it wasn't safe for me to grieve because I didn't have any family to support me in that process at the time, just by virtue of the relationships that were in my family. I had a really sweet boyfriend, but apart from that, I had nowhere to go. So I just got very good at not feeling. And I became completely frozen. I couldn't feel. I thought I was fine. And then when I started to feel, through a very uncomfortable realization that I'd never grieved, it was really painful. You know, I was suddenly like, oh my God, that ice was convenient. That kept all that stuff at bay. And then I had to learn how to not put a brave face on, be super sort of academic and cerebral and driven, and do the things that made me very acceptable to society. You know, I did okay in Oxford. I got a 2-1. I got through it. I managed to give everybody the impression that I was fine, including myself. And when it started to break apart, that was the beginning of the journey that I then had to go through to go, this isn't fine. I'm not fine. None of this is fine. How do I handle that? How do I sit with that and allow for that to be okay? Who are my teachers in this? Because they're not going to be Oxford Dons. Where do I find them? And that then became a sequence of all sorts of different kinds of experiences that ultimately led me to the work that I do now. But I've learned the hard way that I go through cycles of grief. And when it hits, I have to let it hit. And when it's done, it moves naturally through. But they're not quick and convenient, and they don't fit in a 50-minute therapy session. They can take 2 years, unfortunately. And I wish for all of us that we have a holding, even if it's created by ourselves, but some way of containing the permission to surrender and go through those cycles and have those periods of darkness and have those periods of light, and allow for the fruit to bloom when it's time for it to come out, and for the time when it's quiet and inward looking, for that to be a natural place for it too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, for me, one of the most important things to really honor in this conversation is that these things that we're talking about are not easy. I mean, yes, the opening up for wonder for 20 minutes, everyone can do that. And then some of these other bits, does take training, it takes patience. And, in a sense, it's that pronoia that I've had a huge amount of experiences that have taught me how to do this work, and then teachers that have appeared. And in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, a teacher appeared and helped me make that shift from resenting having to process collective grief into fully accepting it with grace.
Yeah.
And I needed another human being who had a huge wellspring of practices that could see what I was doing to help me to make that shift in my perception of it.
Yeah.
And none of that happens overnight. And, it does take refinement. It takes teachers. It takes that real permission to be human. It takes being human with other humans.
Yeah.
And being open for support to come in. And to be open with what's difficult. Because, for example, if I hadn't have told that woman that I was feeling resentful about processing some things that weren't mine that day, I wouldn't have received that teaching that actually showed me how to do it differently.
Yeah.
And that's something that is just, the more that we can hold each other without judgment and allow ourselves to talk about the things that are hard to talk about, to say the things that, we probably shouldn't say out loud, or at least that's what we think.
Yeah.
That's where we discover so much more. And I think that it's in those discoveries that are going to take us forward as humanity.
I completely agree. And I think I'm really noticing that with the men in my world, friends, people who, I did a funeral last week, which was for a very, very old friend's father. And it's a really messy situation, and he doesn't have anybody to process the grief with. And I've been trying to find somebody for him in the place where he lives, and I can't find anyone. It's like this, he needs to be held through at least a conversation. And it's so painful to witness men who are in their vulnerability, opening up their heart, seeking support and community. And he has a great partner and he has a really wonderful best friend, but there isn't a structure around it. You and I share this conversation. You and I are naturally inclined to be open, to embrace, to be present. And we also, I think I'm right in saying we share a world, or like a permission, a community, a series of events, an idea that supports this. And I think women are naturally inclined to be inquisitive and compassionate and emotionally present for each other. And I think that is part of why we stay sane and how we're able to nurture ourselves and other people, and why it is that, you know, it's well documented that in a war-torn country, for example, if you give the women the money, they sort out the problems. If you give the men the money, they spend it on things that are ultimately to do with corrupting further the situation.
Or escaping the pain.
Or escaping the pain. And I think, again, back to the thing about these feminine aspects being so necessary, it's this stuff that is so painfully, acutely needed, and which I think is becoming more and more obvious. Like, I remember watching Prince Harry talk about his grief for his dead mother. It was amazing. I mean, there's somebody who could not be more invested in a tradition of obfuscation of all emotional openness, talking about the fact that he had a terrible time when his mother died and he didn't have anyone to talk to. That alone, right there, that gives permission to a huge swathe of the male population to say, yeah, actually, I've never talked about this, that, you know. And the universality of these things is where I find my piece of work. It's like, this is why I said, in, you know, before, it's like these things are common to everybody, regardless of your race, your background, your level of privilege. We all go through grief at some point, everybody. And none of us have been taught how to handle it. It's crazy. And yet you and I are lucky enough that we can engage in this kind of conversation. And hopefully, by virtue of other people hearing it, they can also engage in the conversation. But it's not taught. You know, we're not given a structure outside of religion to deal with these things. We're not given practices outside of, you know, constructs that may not be entirely relevant to our lives that allow us to explore these things. And it's so desperately necessary in order to bring down the suicide rate, for example, in order to invest people with a full colour palette of experiences of being human. I don't know that there's a one size fits all, other than that there is a sort of a relaxing of the fronting that kind of fits everybody. A sort of a moment of authenticity, a moment of realness. Like I used to run I founded a not-for-profit, and I ran a team, and we did work that was very much to do with, it was about parents and children connecting through play, and the team had to be so present in order for the space to be created where the right stuff, the magic would happen, the wonder would happen. And so before each day of work, I instigated this, what seemed like an incredibly indulgent practice, but actually I think was crucial, where everybody in the team got to share uninterrupted for about 8 minutes, whatever they wanted to share that was keeping them out of the work. So it could be, I've got a sick child at home, I'm going through a breakup, didn't sleep last night, I'm really stressed, this participant on the workshop is really concerning me, any number of things that were distracting them. And we had this practice, and it was 8 people, so that's quite a lot of time, you know, everybody having uninterrupted sharing space, and then having heard where everybody was at and making any provision for that if necessary. We would then engage in what was about to happen, and then we would have a meditation, and then everybody would go and set about the day's work. This took an hour and a half every morning, and it meant that we all operated with total compassion, total honesty, total Jedi mind connection. Like, we didn't even have to talk to each other. We could just throw a glance across a room and you go, oh right, little Johnny needs to have this thing happen. You know, we could communicate because we'd got all of that stuff out of the way. And I feel like that's the way forward. Like, if we're going to do any work of any kind of meaningful connection in the world and with ourselves, to address that stuff before it's the self-care. It's the same thing as, have you slept enough? It's like, have you got a hideous emotional burden that you need to get off your chest before we try to collaborate on something new? It's the same thing. It's like, let's look at the clutter and get it out of the way, and then you create the space where serendipity happens, where wonder happens, where healing happens, where connection happens.
Well, we actually did that for an hour and a half.
Yes, we did.
We started recording this podcast.
I know. I was thinking that. Yeah.
It's a constant practice, that one.
Yeah. And it's allowing it not to be seen as something that is extraneous to purpose or indulgent, but actually crucial. So I teach ritual at work. That's one of the things I teach. And that's one of the things that I impart is that practice, having a check-in. It doesn't have to be 8 minutes. It can be 3 minutes, but it shouldn't really be less than 3 minutes because that gives you just enough time to unpack something. And I was sharing it with this group of people who are taking part in this course as individuals as opposed to as organisations. And several of them said, you could never do that in my workplace. That wouldn't go down very well. And somebody said, what if they started talking negatively about the work? I'm like, well, then that's fine. That's what they need to be getting off their chest. And somebody else said, this will be seen as completely insane. I was like, well, A, if you want me to come in and change their minds, I can do that. B, do you want to try anyway? Or C, do you want to look for another job? And they were like, oh yeah, hang on. Yeah, we could start a company. And it was brilliant. It was like the permission to engage in the necessity of that kind of moment of connection and decluttering before you begin in the day. It's like group morning pages. You know, in the artist way, which you mentioned before, is there's a practice of writing stream of consciousness, 3 sides of A4 every morning by hand, which I do every day, have done for years. That for me is the same process. That's the kind of brain clutter, stressy, boring, whingy, whatever. Or it could be divine, incredible insights into something that I didn't realize I understood. It's usually a mixture of the two, to be honest. But it's like turning a rusty tap on and letting the brown water come out and letting all that stuff go out of the way, and then it runs clear. It's the same idea. It's like, in order to get to the clarity, in order to get to the wonder, you have to have something that clears the crap out of the way first. And whether that's an individual practice that allows for that expression, or whether that's a group practice that allows for the group to engage in that, that's necessary, I think. I think it's just healthy. That's just good housekeeping.
Yeah, totally. And sometimes out of your morning pages, you get a bit of direction as well.
Well, honestly,
for your
every
day.
day. What happens for me is it's 3 sides of A4. I write quite small, so that means it's about half an hour. Usually, the first page to a page and a half is utter detritus. I mean, like, really kind of can't get this song out of my head. I shouldn't have put sugar in my coffee this morning. Oh, hang on a minute. Is the doorbell going to ring because the builder's going to... Like, that kind of level of utter crap. Like, I've got to clean the fridge. I really can't be bothered to clean the fridge. Should I pay somebody to clean it? I mean, that kind of level of, like, just embarrassing. Or if I'm in a relationship situation, obsessing about a boy, you know, some utter crap. And then that
you never grow out of that
one. But at least there's some way to work it out for me on the page.
Yeah.
And then when that runs out, and it does, there's a point usually about page and a half in, it goes, nothing left.
Yeah.
I've bored myself to silence. And then is where it gets interesting. Then what usually happens is I ask a question and an answer starts writing itself. And the voice that writes the answer is compassionate, wise, humorous, calm, non-judgmental, evolved, divinely inspired, and gives me instructions, like specific instructions, like call this person, do that thing, you know, and I can ignore those instructions and it doesn't judge me. It doesn't get angry with me because it isn't coming from a place of judgment. It comes from a different place. So even if it gives me very consistent advice and I ignore it, depends how bad the situation is. When I first started doing the morning pages years and years and years ago, 20 years ago, I was in the wrong relationship. And every morning, and I was in denial about this in every aspect of my life apart from in morning pages. And every morning, my morning pages would tell me to get out of this relationship. And I would write out all of this stuff and then I would go, la, 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 ignoring you. And I'd stay in the thing. And eventually it broke it open. But that clarity, that really beautiful, simple, direct instruction, even around mundane things sometimes, is only available to me after I've got the song out of my head or the fridge cleaning out of my brain into the page. And that's where the space that you described before is is made possible. And then I tell you what, synchronicity goes through the roof.
I'm going to start mine again tomorrow morning.
I think it's really, without shoulding it, because you don't want to should. No. So you have done that. I
have a mischievous relationship with my morning pages.
Do you write them with your non-dominant hand in bright orange?
No, I mostly just don't write them for long periods of time. Because, you know, and I think this is also just a nice point to make, is that we're slow as humans about some stuff.
That's true.
And often we do know what helps us and guides us, and we know what to do in certain situations. Or we hear the thing that says, you know, start the podcast, but we don't do it for a year or two. Whatever it is, and kind of just that recognition that we are slow.
But I think allowing for that slowness is part of the beauty of it. Without put loads of pressure on yourself to achieve and succeed and be extraordinary. Part of it is going, and it's time for a nap, you know, and allowing for those fallow periods and giving yourself permission, if you can, to let yourself not act without it coming out of a natural arising of curiosity. And sometimes you need discipline, but equally, sometimes that slowness is actually our natural rhythm, and to allow that is to allow for a bigger, more expansive, more beautiful appreciation of life itself.
It's time. The guitar is actually saying there was a duet, but you missed it.
I'm so sorry. It's talking too much.
If we didn't miss our duet, we will share it with all of our friends. T was a professional singer.
Oh, God. Okay. Maybe.
But it is time for us now to go and play with the guitar.
Okay.
Tiu, how do we find you? At tiudehaan.com?
That's right, which is spelled, because it's a weird name, so TIU and then DEHAAN.com.
And we'll post links to that and all of the amazing books and resources that you've mentioned.
Cool.
And I just highly recommend that everyone checks out your online courses and all of the wonderful ways in which they can spend time with you.
Thank you.
In a pool of wonder.
Yes. Thank you so much, Amisha. It's been joyful.
You're so welcome. Thank you for spending your precious time with us. As always, you can find links to everything we mention in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on the blog. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible with you, our community. If you loved this and would like to fund our show with a monthly donation or join our online group to connect with other listeners, please visit www.thefutureisbeautiful.co and click on Community and Support. Please also share with friends, hit subscribe, and leave us a review so we can grow. Those gold stars really help others find us, so these ideas can spread. Here is to us, creating a beautiful future together. The Future is Beautiful is made by an all-female team working voluntarily or on reduced rates until our listener support grows. If you have been moved by anything you heard here, please donate the equivalent of buying us a drink. All donations make a huge difference to us and will allow us to keep doing this and remain advertising free. Until next time, I leave you with this question. How will you create beauty in the world?